The weight of silence. Malik Daniels sat in the cold, sterile waiting room of the police station. The hum of the fluorescent lights above buzzed in his ears, a faint but maddening background noise to his racing thoughts. At 19, he looked older than his years, his lean frame wrapped in a faded hoodie that had seen better days. His jeans were worn, and his sneakers, once white, were now a dull gray. His hands trembled as he clutched his phone in his pocket, fingers pressing tightly against the smooth surface of the device. The video stored within it was a ticking time bomb, one that could either dismantle a system of corruption or explode in his face, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. The station smelled of bleach and faint body odor, a combination Malik found unsettling. Across the room, the desk officer, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a sharp tongue, occasionally glanced at him. Her keyboard clicked rhythmically, a sound that seemed to amplify the pressure building in his chest. Malik could feel her suspicion like a tangible force, pressing down on him as if she could sense he was hiding something. His foot tapped nervously against the linoleum floor as he rehearsed his options for the 100th time. "What am I doing here?" he thought, his stomach twisting into knots. He had been summoned, picked up from his job at the local community center where he worked with troubled teens, and brought here under the pretense of answering a few questions. But Malik knew better. This wasn't about questions. It was about control. 3 days ago. The memory was sharp, vivid, as if it had just happened. Malik had been walking home late one evening, the sky a deep navy blue streaked with faint stars. He took a shortcut through an alley behind the old Benson's Market, a route he'd used 100 times before. That's when he saw them. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, his face partially obscured by shadow. Across from him, a man Malik instantly recognized as Reggie, one of the neighborhood's most notorious dealers, leaned casually against a beat-up car. Money exchanged hands quickly, the kind of transaction Malik had been told to ignore his entire life. But this time, something in him snapped. Without thinking, he reached for his phone. He crouched behind a dumpster, holding his breath as he hit record. The video was shaky, but clear enough to see the officer pocket a thick envelope, his face briefly illuminated as he turned to look around. Malik's heart pounded as he captured the damning evidence. Suddenly, the dealer's gaze shifted, his eyes locking onto Malik's hiding spot. "Hey!" Reggie barked, his voice echoing through the alley. Malik bolted, his feet pounding against the pavement as he raced toward safety. He didn't stop until he reached his apartment, locking the door behind him and collapsing on the floor. His hand shook as he replayed the video, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Present day. The sound of a slamming door jolted Malik back to the present. 2 officers appeared, their uniforms crisp and intimidating. One was tall with a shaved head and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through him. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thin mustache and a smirk that made Malik's skin crawl. "Malik Daniels?" the taller officer asked, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Malik nodded, swallowing hard. "Follow us," the shorter one ordered, jerking his head toward the hallway. As they led him down a narrow corridor, Malik's mind raced. What do they know? How much do they suspect? The walls were painted a dull beige, scuffed with years of wear and neglect. Every step they took echoed loudly, a sound that seemed to reverberate through Malik's skull. The officers ushered him into a small interrogation room. A metal table sat in the center, bolted to the floor, with 2 chairs on either side. A camera blinked steadily in the corner, its red light an unblinking eye that watched everything. "Sit," the tall officer commanded. Malik obeyed, lowering himself into the chair and resting his hands on the table. His fingers twitched slightly, a nervous habit he couldn't suppress. The shorter officer leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. "You know why you're here?" "No," Malik replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The taller officer dropped a thick file onto the table, letting it land with a heavy thud. He opened it, revealing a series of photos and documents. Malik's stomach turned when he saw his own face staring back at him, a grainy still from a security camera outside Benson's Market. "Caught you in the wrong place at the wrong time, huh?" the officer said, his tone almost mocking. "I was just walking home," Malik said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't do anything." The officer smirked, leaning forward. "See, that's the problem, kid. You didn't just walk home, did you? You saw something. And now we need to know exactly what." The power of truth. Malik felt his pulse quicken, his mouth dry as sandpaper. He could feel the phone pressing against his leg, the video inside a silent witness to everything he'd seen. But admitting he had it, confessing to being a witness, felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. "I didn't see anything," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. The shorter officer chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You're a terrible liar, kid." The taller one sat back, folding his arms. "We can make this easy, Malik. Tell us what you saw, and maybe we let you walk out of here. Stay quiet, though." He let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken threat louder than words. Malik's mind raced. He thought about his mom, working double shifts to keep their family afloat. He thought about his little sister, Mia, who looked up to him like he was a superhero. And he thought about the neighborhood, the streets filled with kids like him, growing up in the shadows of power they couldn't challenge. He clenched his fists under the table. "If I speak up, they'll come for me. If I stay silent, nothing will ever change." The choice loomed before him, heavy and unforgiving. Malik took a deep breath, steadying himself. The officers watched him closely, their expressions a mix of impatience and menace. The truth burned in his chest, desperate to be released. But Malik knew that once he spoke, there would be no going back. The weight of silence pressed down on him, but so did the weight of responsibility. "All right," Malik said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you." The room went still. The officers leaned in, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. But Malik wasn't about to make it easy for them. The first steps of defiance. The words lingered in the air like the calm before a storm. "I'll tell you." Malik's voice echoed faintly, but his chest felt tight as though his very breath had betrayed him. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their expressions unreadable. The shorter officer, still leaning casually against the wall, pushed off and approached the table. He sat down across from Malik, the metal chair scraping noisily against the floor. "Smart choice, kid," he said, smirking. "Now, why don't you start from the beginning? What were you doing near Benson's Market 3 nights ago?" Malik's fingers curled around the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. He glanced briefly at the camera in the corner, its blinking red light serving as both a reminder and a warning. He couldn't afford to let them know the whole truth. Not yet. "I was walking home from work," Malik began, keeping his tone even. "I cut through the alley like I always do." And the taller officer leaned forward, his icy blue eyes piercing. "What happened next?" Malik hesitated, measuring his words carefully. "I saw some guys talking near a car. I didn't think much of it. Just kept walking." The shorter officer scoffed, shaking his head. "You didn't think much of it. S'mon, kid. We're not stupid. We know what kind of people hang around that alley. What were they doing? Handing out invitations to a birthday party." Malik forced himself to meet the officer's gaze. "I didn't stop to find out." "Convenient," the taller officer muttered, flipping through the file on the table. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across to Malik. "This was taken at the entrance of the alley. That's you, isn't it?" Malik's stomach churned as he looked at the grainy black and white image. There he was, walking past the corner store, his hood pulled up against the evening chill. "That's me," he admitted quietly. The officer leaned back, folding his arms. "So, you were there. Now, let's try this again. What did you see?" The weight of the video. Malik's heart pounded as he fought to maintain his composure. The video in his pocket felt like a lead weight, heavy with consequences. He'd made a copy of it and sent it to Marcus as a precaution, but the original was still on his phone. If they found it now, everything would unravel before he had a chance to act. "I already told you," Malik said, his voice firmer this time. "I didn't stop to see what was going on." The shorter officer's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Listen, kid, you're not doing yourself any favors by holding out on us. We know you saw something. Then why don't you tell me what I saw?" Malik shot back, surprising even himself with the sharpness of his tone. The room fell silent. The officers exchanged another glance, this one filled with unspoken tension. The taller officer leaned forward again, his voice low and measured. "You're playing a dangerous game, Malik. We're trying to help you here, but if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this." "Escalate?" Malik asked, his pulse quickening. "What does that mean?" The officer's gaze hardened. "It means we start digging. We start asking questions about you, your family, your friends. We start looking for reasons to keep you here." A spark of defiance. Malik's jaw tightened. The threat wasn't subtle, and it wasn't empty. He thought of his mom, her tired smile as she left for her cleaning job each morning. He thought of Mia, her eyes lighting up when he helped her with her homework. And he thought of the promises he'd made to himself, to be better, to do better, to protect them both. "You don't have anything on me," Malik said, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his chest. "I didn't do anything wrong." The shorter officer slammed his hand on the table, the sudden sound making Malik jump. "Don't test us, kid. We know you're lying." "Prove it," Malik replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The officer stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Malik's. "You think you're clever? You think this is a game?" Malik didn't flinch. "I think you're wasting your time." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. The taller officer placed a hand on his partner's shoulder, pulling him back. "Enough," he said. "Let's give him a minute to think about his choices." The shorter officer hesitated, glaring at Malik before stepping away. "Don't go anywhere," he muttered, following his partner out of the room. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Malik alone with his thoughts. The turning point. Malik exhaled shakily, his mind racing. He knew the officers weren't done with him, not by a long shot. They would keep pressing, keep threatening, until they got what they wanted. But what they didn't realize was that Malik had already made his decision. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, the video thumbnail glaring back at him like a beacon. He stared at it for a moment, his thumb hovering over the play button. This video was his leverage, his shield, but it was also his responsibility. He opened his messages and typed a quick note to Marcus. "They're pushing me hard. Be ready with the backup." The reply came almost instantly. "Got you. Stay strong." Malik slipped the phone back into his pocket just as the door opened again. The officers returned, their expressions colder than before. The taller one sat down, while the shorter one resumed his post by the wall, arms crossed and glowering. "You ready to talk now?" the taller officer asked, his tone laced with impatience. "I've already told you everything I know," Malik said calmly. The officer sighed, shaking his head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, kid. Maybe you should ask yourselves why I don't trust you." Malik shot back. The line in the sand. The shorter officer stepped forward, his fists clenched. "That's enough. You think you're smart, think you're tough. You're just a scared little punk trying to play hero." Malik met his gaze, his fear replaced by a flicker of defiance. "Maybe I am scared," he admitted, "but at least I'm not a coward." The officer lunged, but the taller one held him back. "Leave it," he snapped. Turning back to Malik, he said, "Fine. If that's how you want to play this, we'll just have to take a closer look at your phone." Malik's heart skipped a beat. "You can't do that," he said quickly. "You need a warrant." The officer smirked. "You think we can't get one?" "You can try," Malik said, his voice steady. "But by the time you do, it won't matter." The officer's smirk faded. "What are you talking about?" Malik leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Let's just say I've got friends who know what's going on. If anything happens to me, or my family, they'll make sure the truth gets out." The room went silent. The officers exchanged a long, tense look before the taller one stood. "We'll see about that," he said, motioning for his partner to follow. As the door closed behind them, Malik leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. He knew he'd just crossed a line, but there was no turning back now. The first steps of defiance had been taken, and the battle was only beginning. The storm within. The door slammed shut behind the officers, leaving Malik alone in the oppressive silence of the interrogation room. The cold metal of the table chilled his fingertips as he ran his hands across its surface, trying to calm the storm raging in his mind. His heart pounded like a war drum, each beat reminding him of the delicate balance he was attempting to maintain. Every decision he made carried consequences, not just for himself, but for his family and the fragile truth he carried in his pocket. He replayed the officer's parting words in his mind. "We'll see about that." The threat lingered, unspoken yet palpable. Malik knew they wouldn't back down easily. They would come at him harder, angrier, more determined. The walls of the station seemed to close in around him, a physical manifestation of the pressure bearing down on him. The echo of memories. As Malik sat in the suffocating stillness, memories began to surface, unbidden and raw. He was 7 years old again, crouching behind the couch in their cramped apartment. The harsh knock on the door had echoed through the room like a gunshot, startling his mother into spilling the basket of laundry she'd been folding. When she opened the door, 2 police officers barged in, their faces hard and unrelenting. They went straight to his father, who stood frozen in the kitchen, a dish towel still in his hands. "Hands behind your back," one of the officers barked, his voice devoid of emotion. "What's this about?" his father asked, his voice steady but his eyes filled with fear. "Just come quietly, Mr. Daniels," the officer replied, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Malik had watched from his hiding spot, tears streaming down his face as his father turned to look at him one last time. "Take care of your mom, Malik," he had said softly before they dragged him out the door. The sound of the door slamming shut had haunted Malik ever since. Now, sitting in this interrogation room, the fear he'd felt as a child returned with a vengeance. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was anger, an anger that had simmered for years, waiting for a moment like this to ignite. The officer's next move. The door opened abruptly, pulling Malik from his thoughts. This time, the shorter officer entered alone, a smug grin plastered across his face. He carried a file folder in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other. Setting the folder down on the table, he took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Malik's. "Thought you might need a little more time to think," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Malik remained silent, his jaw tightening. The officer chuckled, flipping open the folder. "You've got quite a record, don't you? Petty theft when you were 13. Skipping school. A few fights here and there." He leaned forward, his grin widening. Not exactly the picture of an upstanding citizen. Malik's hands clenched into fists under the table. He wanted to lash out, to tell the officer that those mistakes were years behind him, that he had worked hard to turn his life around. But he knew that was exactly what the officer wanted, to provoke him, to make him lose control. Instead, Malik took a deep breath and said, "Is that all you've got?" The officer's grin faltered for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. "Smart mouth, huh? That's gonna get you in trouble, kid." "Maybe," Malik said, his voice steady, "but it won't make me a liar." The officer's smirk vanished entirely. He leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing. "Let me explain something to you, Malik. People like you, people from your neighborhood, You think you can outsmart the system. You think you can fight back and win. Malik's gaze didn't waver. I think the system only works because people like me are too scared to stand up to it. The officer stared at him for a long moment, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Finally, he stood, slamming the folder shut. We'll see how brave you are when this is over. An unexpected visitor. The door slammed shut again, and Malik let out a shaky breath. The weight of the encounter bore down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. He had already come too far. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder with each passing second, the sound gnawing at his nerves. Just when he thought he might lose his mind, the door opened once more. But it wasn't one of the officers who entered this time. It was a woman, a sharp-eyed detective in plain clothes. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her tailored blazer gave her an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. She carried a small notepad and a pen, which she flipped open as she sat down across from Malik. "Malik Daniels," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Claire Harlow with Internal Affairs." Malik blinked in surprise. "Internal Affairs?" "That's right," she said, offering him a faint smile. "I've been assigned to investigate allegations of misconduct involving Officer Martinez and others. I understand you might have information relevant to my investigation." Malik's heart leaped in his chest. Could this be the break I've been waiting for? "Why should I trust you?" he asked cautiously. Detective Harlow's expression softened slightly. "Because I'm not here to protect bad cops. I'm here to root them out. And from what I've heard, you might have the evidence I need to do that." Malik hesitated, his fingers twitching toward his pocket. He wanted to believe her, but trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. "You don't have to give me anything today," she continued, as if sensing his hesitation. "But I'll leave you my card. If you decide you're ready to talk, call me." She slid a business card across the table, her gaze steady. "Just know this. If you stay silent, they win. And people like Martinez will keep doing what they've been doing, unchecked." The power of a choice. When Detective Harlow left, Malik was alone again, but this time, something felt different. Her words echoed in his mind. "If you stay silent, they win." He picked up the card, running his thumb over the embossed text. This was his chance. A chance to make a difference, to expose the truth, to stand up for himself and for his community. But it was also a risk. He knew the officers wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, and the fallout could reach far beyond him. As he sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The video in his pocket was more than just evidence. It was a weapon. And like any weapon, it carried the potential for both justice and destruction. For years, Malik had kept his head down, avoiding trouble, trying to stay invisible. But now, the time for invisibility was over. The time for silence was over. The truth was out there, waiting to be unleashed. And Malik knew that if he didn't take a stand, no one else would. With a deep breath, he slid the card into his pocket alongside his phone. His choice was made. The storm within him had settled, replaced by a quiet determination. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it head-on. The fight was just beginning. A spark ignites. The waiting room buzzed faintly with the sound of fluorescent lights as Malik left the interrogation room. The officers had finally allowed him to go, but not before giving him one last hard glare, a silent promise that they weren't done with him. Detective Harlow's card felt heavy in his pocket, as did the phone beside it, his lifeline, and his greatest vulnerability. The air outside was crisp, the chill biting at his skin as he stepped onto the dimly lit sidewalk. The world felt strangely normal, like it hadn't just tried to crush him under its weight. But Malik wasn't the same anymore. Something inside him had shifted. A spark had ignited, and though it was small, it burned with a fierce determination. The streets speak. Malik's neighborhood was alive with its usual symphony of sounds. Distant laughter from kids playing tag, the rhythmic thud of music spilling out of open windows, and the occasional rumble of a car cruising too fast down the street. The familiar sights and sounds of home should have been comforting, but tonight they only reminded Malik of everything that was at stake. As he walked past the corner store, old Mr. Benson gave him a curious look from behind the counter. Malik nodded in acknowledgement, pulling his hood tighter over his head. The flickering streetlight cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, making the alley behind the store seem darker, more ominous. He quickened his pace, refusing to let his thoughts spiral back to what he had witnessed there just days ago. When Malik finally reached his apartment, he paused at the door, hesitating. His little sister Mia would be waiting inside, probably watching cartoons or working on her school project. His mom might still be at her second job, cleaning offices downtown. They didn't know about the video, the interrogation, or the threats, and Malik wasn't sure how much to tell them. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The faint smell of Mia's after-school snack, a grilled cheese sandwich, still lingered in the air. Sure enough, she was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by a mess of crayons and construction paper. A half-built solar system diorama sat beside her, with the planets labeled in her careful handwriting. "Hey, Malik," she called out without looking up. "Did you know Neptune has, like, 14 moons? That's so cool." Malik smiled despite himself, her enthusiasm cutting through his heavy thoughts. "Yeah, squirt. That is pretty cool." She looked up then, frowning slightly. "You okay? You look worried." "I'm good," he lied, ruffling her hair as he walked past her toward the kitchen. "Just tired." A private conversation. Later that evening, after Mia had gone to bed, Malik sat at the kitchen table with his mom. She had just come home, looking as exhausted as ever but still managing to ask him about his day. As he stirred his bowl of instant ramen, the weight of everything he'd been holding in became too much. "Mom," he began hesitantly, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" She set down her cup of tea, her tired eyes focusing on him. "Of course, baby. What's on your mind?" "Do you think—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Do you think it's worth it to stand up for something, even if it's dangerous?" Her expression softened, and she reached across the table to place a hand on his. "Malik, I've always taught you to do what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. But what if it hurts us?" He pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it puts you or Mia at risk?" She sighed, her fingers tightening around his. "There's no easy answer to that, baby. Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost. But if we don't stand up for ourselves, who will? If we don't fight for what's right, nothing will ever change." Malik looked down at his bowl, her words resonating deeply. She didn't know the specifics of what he was dealing with, but she had given him the clarity he needed. The call for help. The next morning, Malik sat on the edge of his bed, staring at Detective Harlow's card. The neatly printed name and contact information seemed to taunt him, daring him to take the next step. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Marcus. "You good? Got the video locked up tight. Just say the word." Malik smiled faintly at his friend's unwavering loyalty. Marcus had always been the one person he could count on, no matter what. With a deep breath, Malik dialed the number on Harlow's card. The phone rang twice before her voice came through, calm and professional. "Detective Harlow speaking." "It's Malik Daniels," he said, his throat dry. I have something you need to see." There was a pause, and then her tone shifted, becoming more focused. "All right, Malik. Let's meet somewhere safe. You pick the place." A risky alliance. Malik chose the community center where he worked. It was a place he trusted, where he felt like he had some control. When Detective Harlow arrived, she was dressed casually, blending in with the parents dropping off their kids. She greeted Malik with a nod, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Let's talk in private," she said, gesturing to an empty office. Once inside, Malik closed the door and took out his phone. "This video," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "It shows an officer taking money from a dealer. It's clear. Their faces, the exchange, it's all there." Harlow's expression hardened, her jaw tightening. "And this officer, it's Martinez, isn't it?" Malik nodded. "Yeah, and I sent a copy to a friend, just in case." "Smart," she said approvingly. "Do you trust this friend?" "With my life." She sat back, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Malik, this is big, but it's also dangerous. Martinez has connections, and he won't go down without a fight. If you go public with this, he'll come after you, and not just him. People who work with him, people who depend on him, they won't be happy." "I know," Malik said quietly, "but I can't just stay quiet. Not anymore." Harlow studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, here's what we're going to do. I'll take this video and start building a case, but you need to keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and if Martinez or anyone else comes after you, you call me immediately." She reached into her bag and handed him a second business card. "This has my direct line. Don't hesitate to use it." A plan in motion. As Malik watched Harlow leave, he felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead was anything but clear. He knew Martinez wouldn't go quietly, and he knew that standing up for the truth meant putting everything he cared about on the line. But as he walked out of the community center and into the bright afternoon sun, Malik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. And he wasn't alone. The pushback. The days following Malik's meeting with Detective Harlow felt like walking a tightrope strung high above a pit of uncertainty. Every step brought a fresh wave of tension. He kept glancing over his shoulder, scanning for threats, while pretending everything was normal at home. His mother and Mia noticed the change in his demeanor, but he kept his explanations vague, unwilling to drag them further into the storm brewing around him. At the same time, Malik began to notice subtle changes in the neighborhood. The presence of police patrols had increased, but not in a way that made anyone feel safer. Officers lingered near corners, eyes sharp and accusatory, their cars parked in conspicuous places. People whispered about it in hushed tones, their fear palpable. Malik knew it was no coincidence. Word had likely spread among certain officers that someone was stirring the pot, threatening to expose the corruption that had quietly poisoned their streets for years. Martinez wasn't going to wait for the system to deal with him. He would handle it his own way. Unwelcome encounters. It started with a knock at Malik's door late one evening. He had just finished helping Mia with her math homework when the sound echoed through their small apartment. His mother, busy folding laundry, looked up, puzzled. "Are you expecting anyone?" she asked. "No," Malik said, his chest tightening. He approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway were two men he didn't recognize, dressed in plain clothes, but with a presence that screamed law enforcement. Their eyes were hard, their postures tense. Malik hesitated for a moment before opening the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Malik Daniels," one of the men asked, his tone flat. "Who's asking?" The man held up a badge briefly before slipping it back into his pocket. "Detectives. We're following up on an ongoing investigation. Mind if we come in?" Malik's instincts screamed at him to say no, but he knew refusing would only make things worse. He opened the door slightly wider, stepping aside as the two men entered. His mother appeared in the hallway, her eyes narrowing at the unexpected visitors. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "Just a routine visit," one of the detectives said smoothly, his gaze sweeping the small apartment. "We've been hearing some interesting things about Malik. Thought we'd come by and see if he'd like to clarify a few things." Malik's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken threats lurking beneath their words. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly. The second detective smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be, kid. You've been asking a lot of questions, talking to the wrong people. That's a dangerous game." His mother stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. "If you have questions for my son, you can ask them formally. Otherwise, I think it's time for you to leave." The first detective raised his eyebrows, clearly unimpressed. "We're just having a conversation, ma'am. No need to get worked up." Malik met his mother's gaze, silently urging her to stay calm. "We're done here," he said firmly, his heart pounding in his chest. The detectives exchanged a look before heading toward the door. "You take care now, Malik," one of them said, his tone dripping with thinly veiled menace. "Wouldn't want anything to happen to you or your family." As the door closed behind them, Malik let out a shaky breath. His mother turned to him, her face etched with worry. "Malik," she said softly, "what's going on?" "I can't tell you everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm trying to do the right thing." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just be careful, baby. The right thing can be dangerous." A neighborhood on edge. The next day, Malik walked through the streets of his neighborhood, his senses on high alert. The detective's visit had rattled him, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him into silence. As he passed the corner store, he noticed Reddy, the dealer he had recorded in the video, leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette. Their eyes met briefly, and Malik quickly looked away, his pulse quickening. Reggie smirked, the kind of smirk that said he knew exactly what was going on. Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "Meeting at 6. Same spot. Got news." He typed a quick reply. "Be there." The meeting would be at the community center, where Marcus and a few others had started gathering to discuss how they could push back against the corruption in their neighborhood. What had started as a small group of friends had grown into something larger, a network of teens and young adults determined to make a difference. The community rallies. When Malik arrived at the community center that evening, the room was already buzzing with energy. Marcus stood near the front, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. Around him, a dozen or so others sat on folding chairs, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. "All right, everyone," Marcus began as Malik took a seat. "We've got a lot to talk about tonight." He gestured to a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. "First off, some of you might have noticed an increase in patrols around the neighborhood. That's not a coincidence. Word's out that someone's challenging the status quo, and certain people aren't happy about it." There were murmurs of agreement around the room. "We've also got confirmation that Internal Affairs is digging into Martinez," Marcus continued. "But it's gonna take time. In the meantime, we need to watch each other's backs." "What about the video?" someone asked. "Is it safe?" Marcus nodded. "It's safe. Multiple copies, encrypted storage. They're not getting their hands on it." Malik spoke up then, his voice steady. "We need to do more than just wait. We need to keep the pressure on. Let the neighborhood know what's really happening. If people see us standing up, they'll start standing up too." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. Finally, one of the older teens nodded. "He's right. They're counting on us to stay quiet. If we speak out, they lose their power." A plan takes shape. Over the next hour, the group brainstormed ways to raise awareness without putting themselves directly in harm's way. They talked about distributing flyers, organizing neighborhood watch groups, and using social media to share their message. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," Malik said, his voice filled with conviction. "We're fighting for our families, for the kids who look up to us, for the future of this neighborhood." By the time the meeting ended, a plan was in place. Everyone left with a renewed sense of purpose, their fear tempered by the knowledge that they weren't alone in this fight. As Malik walked home that night, the shadows seemed a little less oppressive, the streetlights a little brighter. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, But for the first time, he felt like they had a chance, a real chance, to change things. A dangerous countermove. But the next day brought fresh challenges. Malik woke to find a patrol car parked outside his apartment building, the officers inside watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. As he walked Mia to school, he noticed a marked increase in police presence around the neighborhood. It was clear they were sending a message. We see you. We know what you're doing. And we're not going to let it happen without a fight. Later that afternoon, Marcus called with troubling news. Reggie's been talking, he said, his voice tense. Word is, Martinez is looking to make an example out of someone. And you're at the top of the list. Malik's grip tightened on the phone. Let him try, he said, his voice calm but firm. We're not backing down. And he meant it. The spark that had ignited within him was now aflame, burning brighter with every attempt to snuff it out. Malik knew the fight was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Because standing up for what was right wasn't just about courage. It was about survival. For himself, for his family, and for the neighborhood that had raised him. The turning tide. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and small victories. Malik and the group worked tirelessly to implement their plans, but every step forward felt like wading through quicksand. The neighborhood, though still wary, was beginning to stir with whispers of hope. People were starting to ask questions, starting to see the cracks in the system that had loomed over them for so long. But with progress came pushback. The patrol car outside Malik's building was now a constant presence. Officers lingered in the shadows, their gazes sharp and accusatory. Every time Malik left the apartment, he could feel their eyes on him, a silent reminder of the stakes. The first wave of resistance. It began with the flyers, printed on cheap paper with a single bold headline. STANDUP, Speak Outie, Fight BACK. The flyers listed key points about residents' rights, instructions on how to report police misconduct, and a number for a legal aid hotline. Malik and the group had spent hours distributing them, slipping them under doors, tucking them into mailboxes, and leaving stacks in local businesses. The response was immediate. Within hours, the flyers became the talk of the neighborhood. Some people were cautious, afraid of what it might mean to be associated with such an overt act of defiance. But others embraced the message, emboldened by the realization that they weren't alone. However, the backlash came just as quickly. Patrol officers began tearing down the flyers as soon as they spotted them, stuffing them into trash bags with thinly veiled disdain. Store owners who had allowed flyers on their counters suddenly became nervous, claiming they couldn't afford the risk. One night, as Malik walked home from another late meeting at the community center, he found the remnants of their efforts scattered across the sidewalk, trampled and smeared with dirt. His chest tightened with frustration, but he pressed on, determined not to let the small setbacks overshadow the larger goal. A neighborhood united. The tipping point came during an impromptu meeting at Old Joe's auto shop, one of the few places in the neighborhood where Malik and his friends could talk without prying eyes. Joe, a grizzled man in his 60s with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, had offered his garage as a safe space. I've been in this neighborhood longer than most of you have been alive, Joe said, leaning against a workbench. Seen a lot of folks try to stand up to the system. Most of them get crushed. But you kids, you've got something different. You've got each other. Marcus chimed in, his voice steady. And we've got the truth. They can't hide forever. That video, Joe said, pointing a wrench at Malik, is your ace. But it's not enough. You need people to back you up, to make enough noise that they can't ignore you. We're working on it, Malik replied, his mind racing. The flyers are just the start. We need something bigger, something they can't sweep under the rug. Joe nodded thoughtfully. Then you need the people. All of them. Not just the kids in this garage. Malik glanced around the room, the faces of his friends filled with determination. He knew Joe was right. This wasn't just their fight. It was a fight for everyone in the neighborhood. and it was time to make them see that. The rally. The idea for the rally came from Malik's mother, who had overheard him brainstorming with Marcus one night. She had entered the room, her arms crossed, and said simply, "If you want people to listen, you need to bring them together." It started small. Marcus reached out to a few people he trusted, who reached out to a few more. Word spread quietly but quickly, a ripple of hope spreading through the neighborhood. By the end of the week, dozens of residents had agreed to meet at the local park. The night before the rally, Malik sat in his room, staring at his phone. The video felt like a burning coal in his pocket, its importance growing with every passing moment. He had sent additional copies to multiple people in the group, ensuring that even if something happened to him, the truth would survive. But the weight of it still pressed on him. "Malik." Mia's small voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "What's up, Squirt? Are you scared?" she asked, her wide eyes full of concern. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, a little." "Why do you keep doing it then?" Malik smiled faintly, pulling her into a hug. "Because sometimes being scared means you're doing something brave." The day of the rally. The park was alive with energy when Malik arrived, the crowd larger than he had dared to hope. Families with strollers, teenagers in hoodies, and elderly residents with canes, all had come, their faces reflecting a mix of determination and trepidation. Marcus stood near the makeshift stage, a small podium borrowed from the community center. "It's happening," he said, clapping Malik on the back. "This is really happening." Malik nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "For too long," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "we've been told to stay silent, to keep our heads down, to accept that things will never change." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But that's not true. Change is possible. It starts with us, with standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let fear control us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Malik felt a surge of hope. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He talked about the corruption that had plagued their neighborhood, about the need to hold those in power accountable, and about the strength they had as a community. By the time he finished, the crowd was on its feet, their cheers echoing through the park. Malik stepped back, his heart swelling as he realized that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. The pushback grows stronger. But the rally didn't go unnoticed. The next day, patrol cars swarmed the park, officers questioning anyone they deemed suspicious. Store owners reported increased visits from concerned officers who warned them to stay out of trouble. Even Malik's family wasn't spared. One evening, they returned home to find a warning scrawled on their apartment door. "Stay in your place." Malik's mother was shaken, but she refused to let it deter them. "They're scared," she said firmly. "And scared people make mistakes." Detective Harlow called the following morning, her voice urgent. "Martinez is getting desperate," she warned. "There's chatter about him trying to discredit you. Be careful." "I will," Malik promised. "But we're not stopping." A stand against fear. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood began to change. The rally had sparked something deep and unshakable. People were organizing, watching out for each other, and refusing to let intimidation silence them. Malik knew the road ahead was long and fraught with danger. But for the first time, he felt like they were making progress. The video was still their ace, but the real power lay in the people who had finally found their voices and weren't afraid to use them. As he stood on his apartment balcony one evening, looking out over the flickering lights of his neighborhood, Malik felt a sense of calm settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. And this time, they weren't backing down. The breakthrough. The days leading up to the next major step in Malik's fight felt like the calm before a storm. The momentum of the rally lingered, a faint undercurrent of hope running through the neighborhood, but so did the threats. Patrol cars were more frequent, Their slow crawls down the streets carrying an unspoken message. We're watching. At home, his mother's resolve remained unshaken, but the worry in her eyes was impossible to miss. Mia had started to ask fewer questions, sensing the weight of the situation but not fully understanding its depth. Malik carried the burden silently, knowing the storm would break soon, and when it did, everything would change. The crack in the armor. One evening, Malik received a call from Detective Harlow. Her voice, calm but tinged with urgency, cut through the static on the line. "Malik, we've got something," she said. "A witness, someone willing to come forward about Martinez and his dealings. But they're scared, and they want assurances." "Who?" Malik asked, his pulse quickening. "Can't say yet," Harlow replied. "But it's someone who's seen a lot. If we can get their testimony alongside your video, it could blow this case wide open." Malik felt a flicker of hope, but tempered it with caution. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep the pressure on," she said. "Martinez is already on edge. If he thinks we're closing in, he'll slip up." After hanging up, Malik sat in silence, staring at his phone. He could feel the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on him, heavier than ever. Martinez makes a move. The next day, as Malik left the auto shop after his shift, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. Its windows were tinted, but he could feel the eyes watching him. He ignored it, keeping his head down as he walked toward the bus stop. When the SUV began to creep forward, Malik's heart raced. He quickened his pace, ducking into a narrow alley. The SUV couldn't follow, but its presence confirmed what he already knew. Martinez wasn't going to wait for the system to handle them. He was taking matters into his own hands. By the time Malik got home, his nerves were frayed. He double-checked the locks on the door, pacing the living room as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You good? Heard some guys asking about you at the corner store." Malik replied, "I'm fine. Just stay low." He knew things were escalating, but he couldn't let fear stop him now. A community in action. The neighborhood was no longer the silent, fractured place it had been weeks ago. Malik's rally and the flyers had sparked a collective consciousness, a realization that they didn't have to face their struggles alone. People were talking about the patrol cars, the harassment, and the corruption that had festered for years. Small acts of defiance began to emerge. Residents started recording police interactions openly, their phones a quiet yet powerful statement. "We see you." Stores that had been reluctant to display flyers now did so proudly, their windows plastered with messages of solidarity. Even Mia's middle school had gotten involved. A group of parents had organized a meeting with the principal to discuss increased police presence near the school, citing concerns about safety and bias. Malik watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride as he saw the ripple effects of their efforts. But Martinez wasn't backing down. If anything, he was getting bolder. The trap is set. 2 nights later, Malik received a call from Marcus. "You need to come to the community center," Marcus said, his voice tight. Now, Malik didn't ask questions. He grabbed his jacket and left, his heart pounding with every step. When he arrived, Marcus was waiting outside, his expression grim. "What's going on?" Malik asked. "We got word that Martinez is planning something big," Marcus said. "Reggie's been bragging about it, saying Martinez has a way to shut you up for good." Malik's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to be ready. Harlow said she's close to getting the warrant for his arrest, but if Martinez makes his move first, then we need to force his hand." Malik interrupted. Marcus frowned. "What are you thinking?" "We need to make sure everyone knows what's happening," Malik said. "If Martinez tries anything, he won't just be dealing with me. He'll be dealing with all of us." The final rally. The plan was risky, but Malik knew it was their best shot. They organized another rally, this time larger and more focused. Flyers went up across the neighborhood, and word spread through text messages and whispers. By the time the night of the rally arrived, the park was packed with people. Malik stood at the podium, the crowd stretching before him like a sea of faces. He felt the weight of their expectations, their hopes and fears resting on his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Tonight isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's about all of us. It's about standing up to the people who think they can take advantage of us because we're scared. It's about showing them that we're not afraid anymore." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Malik held up a hand, silencing them. "But it's also about accountability," he continued, "about making sure the truth comes out, no matter how hard they try to bury it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "This video," he said, holding it up, "is just the beginning. We're going to shine a light on the darkness that's been holding this neighborhood down, and we're not stopping until justice is served." The breaking point. As the rally continued, Malik noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. His heart sank when he saw Martinez standing there, flanked by two other officers. Their uniforms gleamed under the park lights, but their expressions were anything but professional. Martinez stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Malik Daniels, you think you're some kind of hero." The crowd fell silent, turning to face the confrontation. Malik stood firm. "I'm just someone who's tired of keeping quiet." Martinez sneered, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You're playing with fire, kid. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "Maybe not," Malik said, his voice steady, "but I know what I'm fighting for, and I'm not stopping." Before Martinez could respond, a figure emerged from the crowd. Detective Harlow, flanked by two internal affairs agents. She held up a piece of paper, her expression cold and authoritative. "Officer Martinez," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the park, "you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and abuse of power." The crowd erupted into cheers as the agents moved forward, placing Martinez in handcuffs. He struggled, his face contorted with rage, but Harlow didn't flinch. "You think this changes anything?" Martinez spat as they led him away. "You think this neighborhood will be any different?" "It will," Malik said quietly, his voice firm, "because we're not afraid anymore." A new beginning. In the days that followed Martinez's arrest, the neighborhood began to shift in ways Malik hadn't thought possible. Patrol cars became less frequent, their oppressive presence fading into memory. Residents began to organize more formally, creating watch groups and holding community meetings. The video Malik had recorded became a rallying cry, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people stood together. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the corruption that had plagued the neighborhood and the grassroots movement that had risen to fight it. Malik stood at the center of it all, not as a leader but as a symbol of what was possible. He knew the fight wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still systems to dismantle and rebuild. But for the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. As he walked through the neighborhood one evening, passing familiar faces who now greeted him with nods of respect, Malik felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The storm had broken, and though the road ahead was long, he was ready to face it, because the tide had turned and they weren't going back. The light after the storm. The days following Martinez's arrest felt surreal. Malik walked through the neighborhood with a strange mix of relief and cautious optimism. The streets seemed quieter now, less burdened by the constant presence of patrol cars and suspicious gazes. People nodded at him when he passed, some even offering words of thanks or encouragement. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel entirely like a battleground. But Malik knew this wasn't the end. The fight against corruption wasn't something that could be won overnight. Martinez was only one piece of a larger problem, and Malik had no illusions about how deep the rot went. Still, for the first time, there was hope, a chance to build something better. Rebuilding trust. Detective Harlow met Malik a few days after the arrest. They sat across from each other in the same community center office where they had first spoken, the atmosphere lighter now, but still tinged with seriousness. "You did good, Malik," Harlow said, flipping through a folder of documents. "The video, the rally, it all played a part in getting us here. Martinez's arrest is just the beginning. We're already uncovering more connections, more evidence." Malik nodded, his hands resting on the table. "What happens now?" "Now," Harlow said, "we start rebuilding. It's going to take time, and there will be pushback, but with people like you leading the charge, we have a real shot." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Me? Leading the charge?" She smiled faintly. "You've already proven you can. People in your neighborhood are looking to you, Malik. You've shown them what's possible." He hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm just one guy," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Harlow replied. "One person to spark something bigger. A community transformed." The changes in the neighborhood didn't come all at once, but they came steadily. Local businesses began organizing to support community efforts, hosting fundraisers, and donating supplies for school programs. The parents group from Mia's school started a petition to review police practices in the area, demanding more transparency and accountability. Malik and his friends expanded their network, turning their grassroots movement into a formal organization. They called it Voices of Change, a name that resonated with everyone involved. Weekly meetings at the community center grew larger, drawing people from all walks of life. Teens, parents, seniors, all united by a shared vision for a better future. Marcus, who had once been content to stay in the background, emerged as one of the group's strongest organizers. He handled logistics with precision, ensuring every rally, meeting, and initiative ran smoothly. Malik found himself stepping into a leadership role, his words carrying weight as he spoke to reporters, city officials, and anyone willing to listen. "It's not about me," Malik would often say. "It's about us, about what we can do together. A family united." At home, the changes were just as profound. Malik's mother, once wary of his involvement, now wore a quiet pride. She had joined one of the parent advocacy groups, using her voice to demand better resources for the community. Malik often caught her staying up late, poring over articles and reports, determined to make a difference. Mia, too, had blossomed. Her once innocent view of the world had been tempered by the realities of their fight, but it hadn't dimmed her spirit. She started a small club at school called Bright Futures, where kids could talk about their dreams and how to achieve them. Malik helped her print flyers, his heart swelling with pride every time she brought home a new story of a kid finding their voice. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mia turned to Malik with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will ever go back to how they were before?" Malik shook his head. "No, but I don't think we want them to." His mother nodded in agreement. "Sometimes change is the only way forward." The face of accountability. Martinez's trial became a focal point for the entire neighborhood. Malik attended every hearing, often with Marcus, his mother, and other members of Voices of Change by his side. The courtroom was packed with reporters, residents, and officials, all eager to see how the justice system would handle a case so steeped in corruption. When Malik was called to testify, he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. As he recounted the events that had led to the video, the threats, and the rally, he spoke with a calm certainty that belied the fear he had once felt. He was no longer the scared teenager sitting in an interrogation room, unsure of his own power. He was a voice for his community, and he refused to be silenced. Martinez sat across the room, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. But Malik didn't flinch. He looked the disgraced officer in the eye and spoke the truth, knowing that every word brought them closer to justice. When the verdict finally came, guilty on multiple counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Malik sat back in his seat, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't just about Martinez. It was about the message his conviction sent. Corruption wouldn't be tolerated, and the voices of the people couldn't be ignored. A new chapter. With Martinez behind bars, the neighborhood continued to heal. Malik and his team worked tirelessly to push for further reforms, meeting with city officials to discuss policies that would protect residents and hold law enforcement accountable. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed, and soon, other neighborhoods began reaching out, inspired by their success. One afternoon, Malik received a call from a community leader in another part of the city. "We've been following what you're doing," the man said. "We could really use your help." Malik agreed without hesitation. Voices of Change began to expand, its mission growing beyond their own neighborhood. Malik found himself traveling across the city, meeting with other communities, sharing their story, and helping others find their voices. The legacy of courage. Months later, Malik stood on the same stage where he had given his first rally speech, addressing a crowd that had more than tripled in size. The faces before him were filled with hope, determination, and pride. He thought about how far they had come, from fear and silence to action and change. "When we started this journey," Malik began, his voice steady, "we didn't know what we were capable of. We didn't know if we could make a difference. But we learned something important along the way. When we stand together, we are unstoppable." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound washing over Malik like a wave. He looked out at the people who had become his family, his community, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. As the cheers faded, he ended with words that had become his mantra. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's not easy, and it's not perfect, but it's worth it. Every step we take brings us closer to the future we deserve." The future. In the quiet moments after the rally, Malik stood at the edge of the park, watching as people began to disperse. Marcus joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Never thought we'd get here," Marcus said, grinning. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Malik nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it does." He looked up at the sky, the stars faint but steady above them. The fight wasn't over, and there would always be more to do. But for now, Malik allowed himself to feel the triumph of what they had achieved. Because in the face of fear and oppression, they had stood up, spoken out, and fought back. And they had won.